Hello and welcome to the FilmFile. Hello and welcome, as ever. I'm Lee Ford.
And I'm still Andy Beacon.
Which is a good thing, because that would be a very strange time paradoxy kind of show already. And we've had a time paradox already, because we started recording this a little bit earlier than what we normally do. And we were suddenly hit by strange delays. Andy was not quite hearing me on time. In fact, he was hearing me from back in 1987.
It was a weird kind of like Doctor Who kind of time distortion effect, and it kind of freaked me out.
What was that movie? Frequency, the one with Dennis Quaid in. Remember that? It was a bit like that for a minute.
Oh yeah, we're sending messages through the ether into the past and speak. Yeah, there was a TV series that was made that adapted it for different formats, which was okay.
I don't remember the TV series. I remember the movie. And anyway, our recording started off a bit like that. Okay, so as you know, and you're a follower of the show, that each week we do a deep dive into a classic movie. And we can't get much more classic than this particular film, because this particular film basically launched the summer blockbuster movie, changed movie making, changed film history, changed film marketing, and is, of course, the 1975 American thriller directed by Steven Spielberg. It's my favorite thriller of all time. It's in my
Just get in the door.
top 3 films of all time. It is Jaws.
It's okay. It was just a package getting thrown through the door.
All right, no worries.
Yep.
So I've given the intro to it.
Yep.
Trailer
there.
And I will come in. Yes, Jaws, directed by Steven Spielberg, the film that made the beard the man who he is today, that launched his career in a way that changed box office revenue forever. It's based on the 1974 novel by Peter Benchley. And it's the story of a man-eating great white shark that attacks beachgoers at a summer resort town, prompting police chief Martin Brody, played wonderfully by Roy Schneider, to hunt with the help of a marine biologist, played by Richard Dreyfuss, and a professional shark hunter, the late great Robert Shaw, to stop the shark's onslaught. As I said at the top end, this is, well, close to being my favorite film. If I have to do that, you've got to pick one film, then it's always between Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid and Jaws, because they both mean so much to me. This film blows me away. As I said, it's not just the prototype summer blockbuster, regarded as a watershed film that changed motion picture history. It's also one of the best thrillers you will ever see. It's Steven Spielberg at the beginning of his career proving what a great director he is, because he took basically a pulp novel and turned it not necessarily into high art, but into the highest octane thriller that you can imagine. Why? Because he used filmmaking technique against adversity of how the film was coming together to produce something that is not only masterful, but a masterclass in thriller making and directing. Andy, your thoughts on when and how Jaws came into your life?
I was first introduced to Jaws through. I had an uncle who obsessed over new technology, and so he was the first person to buy a VHS player. He was the first person to get a large TV. He always bought new tech as soon as it came out, and so when he had his VHS player, one film that he had on VHS was Jaws. And while we were around there, and I'm a young, wee little whippersnapper, and he's showing off his VHS player with by putting in some tapes and showing bits of films. Then he shows Jaws, and he's basically skipping through most of the film, but just getting to all the juicy bits and showing us look at this. Oh, look, he gets bit in half. Oh, look at this bit. Oh. And as a young child, I was fascinated by it. I was already fascinated with horror. I was a fan of Hammer horror stuff, and I was already like, as we've explained previously, I was a fan of cinema from an early age. So I knew that I had to see this film in some way, shape, or form. And so it was a few months later that I finally got to see the whole film in full, and it didn't disappoint. It it's just one of those films where everything that went wrong so well to make it the great film that it is. It's packed with not only like shock moments, when it gets bloody, it does get quite bloody for like what is a low rated film. It's recently been reassessed as a 12A, but it was the equivalent of a PG, which means that, hey, your kids can watch this, no problem. And I'll be honest here, my kids have watched this from the age of 5 because I think that everyone should watch this at an early age because it's such a thrill ride. It's a roller coaster summer blockbuster template that has been copied and copied and copied throughout the decades, and for very good reason. Spielberg managed to deliver a film that makes such effective use of location, effects, lack of effects, cast, and camera tricks. Can I just take a moment to just say that the crash zoom camera effect is my favorite effect that can be done on film? And Spielberg uses it beautifully with the crash zoom into Roy Schneider's face as he sees something horrific happening out on the water. It's a beautifully positioned moment, and it's the perfect use of it. This film is something that I go back to at least once a year. I have been known to watch this multiple times in a week because I love to re-explore it and re-explore it and re-explore it, and I never tire of it.
I don't blame you. I mean, as you said, this film was, as you said, this film was made with adversity, and everyone knows the story that the mechanical shark didn't work. Uh, the insistence of shooting it on location to give it that sense of authenticity rather than on a studio set. The film was shot up in Maine, and the shark was designed in, if I remember correctly, in a water tank. But when they got it out to sea, the salt in the sea corroded the shark, and so literally the shark would work for seconds, and that's how much they got. So Spielberg did the smart thing. Instead of making the Godzilla as he intended to do of shark movies, he made the Psycho of shark movies, and let the camera and the music, importantly, let's not forget John Williams' score,
Mm.
because apart from being iconic, it does a remarkable thing. It tells you when the shark is there. It's the shark's signature tune. And that got rid of so many of the issues that they had. And also the fact that he brought in Thelma Schumacher to edit the film, who edited for Scorsese, and made this tightly crafted, and it is a beautifully crafted movie, and made it work. And it was a horrific shoot, and he nearly got sacked from it. And thank goodness he didn't, because in an alternate reality, this wouldn't have been the film that it was. It is a masterful piece of filmmaking. And this was Steven Spielberg's second movie after Sugarland Express. And of course, he'd done the TV movie Duel, which is what brought him into that. So, a little bit of history on the film. So, Peter Benchley's book was huge. He was allowed to write the first draft. Zanuck and Brown, who were the producers on it, originally wanted filmmaker John Sturges, who'd done The Old Man and the Sea. And then they offered the job to Dick Richards, whose directorial debut, The Culpeper Cattle Company, had come out previously. Spielberg wanted the job. He was 26 at the time. He'd already done the one movie, and he was insistent. When he didn't look like he was going to get it, he was up to do a film called Lucky Lady, which I have seen, and he made the right choice by choosing Jaws, because Jaws made his career, literally made his career. He also decided he wanted to stick to the novel, and he wanted the second half of the novel to be the shark hunt, as long as he could rewrite the first act, Act One and Act Two, and that's where the film works, because even though you've got this, and he dumped a lot of Benchley's subplots, but what works on this is the fact that he brings characterization He makes those characters, especially Roy Schneider's character, he makes them feel real. And because we care about them, then we care about what happens to them once these guys get out to sea. And that's when the film changes. There is definitely two halves for this film. And each one progresses the story on and the characterization to create one of the some not only some of the best and memorable dialogue you will find in a thriller, but also some of the most memorable action. It is an absolutely superbly created and crafted movie.
The casting on this film was critical. Spielberg turned down names such as Charlton Heston because he was concerned that a big name's screen presence would unbalance the film. So he went with known actors, but not huge names. Scheider, Dreyfus, Murray Hamilton, and Robert Shaw, amongst others. And Scheider, in the primary role of Brody, is so well placed that it feels like the role was actually written with him in mind. He's immediately believable, and like you've said, you completely engage with them from those early scenes. His character as a family man and police chief, you really start to relate to him and you connect with him and you start to care about him. Dreyfus, when he comes in with his enthusiastic charm, this role in particular had been redrafted for the actor to make the best use of Dreyfus's on-set nature. And basically, Dreyfus represents Spielberg himself, the enthusiasm, the fascination, and this is something that became a theme with Spielberg. He always puts a character that relates to himself within his films. The pair
Yep.
balance well, and then you have the inclusion of the grizzled Robert Shaw as Quint, a character clearly inspired by Captain Ahab, who rounds out the trio perfectly. Shaw, in particular, famously improvised a lot of dialogue, including that absolutely amazing Indianapolis speech, which the whole storytelling and the tension of that scene is so meticulously put together. And to know that Shaw was maybe not quite with it for most of the time, but he delivered so well on set. The three of them together in that latter half of the film as they're doing the shark hunt, the different energies that they each bring make it just such compelling viewing.
It does, and there were tensions between Robert Shaw and Richard Dreyfuss, and that plays out in the film, and that antagonism that Shaw was giving Dreyfuss helps mold the relationships on film as well. Robert Shaw was a difficult man. Apparently, he had a drinking habit, but he was a boy. What a great actor! And you can't think about this film because you don't just think about the shark. When you picture this film in your head, you picture Snyder, you picture Dreyfus. You don't picture the shark. You think of the cast. Again, that's one of the strengths of it, because you don't think of the monster. You think of the people involved. It is just an absolutely superb film. I've seen it time and time again. I've shown it to film students, and yes, you can look back at some of the effects work. And you know what? I'm always glad that Spielberg didn't go back and CGI it, and didn't go
Yeah.
back and revisit it the way that Lucas would have, for instance. And I'm not to throw shade on George Lucas, but it stands up as a film of its time, and it stands up as a piece of filmmaking of its time. It is absolutely stunning. And having grown up through, and I didn't see Jaws when it was released, but having grown up through that period, I remember the kids at school raving over this, going back multiple times to see Jaws. I saw it on its re-release. I don't know why. I don't know why I didn't get to see it. I'm disappointed that I didn't go then, but hey, that's history. But there was a real sense of people talking about it. Everybody spoke about Jaws, and so much so that it it it, it produced just incredible box office.
Yeah.
It overtook The Godfather as the highest grossing film at the North American box office. And it is now, to this day, still considered one of the highest box office films. And as I said, it changed cinema. It gave us the summer blockbuster movie. Because before that, folks, they didn't do summer blockbuster movies. And Jaws, and then subsequently
Uh,
Star Wars, and then Close Encounters and Superman all fed into that way that cinema has changed and the marketing of film, because up until that point, really, the term blockbuster was only used for high profile films like The Godfather.
Yeah, I don't know what you said then because you dropped off on my connection
Okay,
for
it was good.
the
All of it
last
was good.
minute. So I'm looking forward to re-listening to that one. I just want to jump back to you when you spoke about the music and the excellent theme that John Williams added into there. That low bass conditioning of like this is the shark approaching is best used when it's not actually used. You are so conditioned by the music into when you hear that the shark's nearby, that on a later point in the film, when the shark just lunges out the water when he's feeding the chum out, it catches you off guard because you were not signaled that the shark was anywhere nearby. The silence was the perfect use of music for one moment. Brilliant filmmaking from Spielberg. And you keep dropping in and out at the moment.
Yeah, you too, buddy. I'm catching bits and pieces of that.
Well, I've just rounded off that bit. I think if we're going to be jumping in and out, should we just round it off with just a quick mention of the sequels?
Yeah. So, of course, any film that's big, the studio want to make sequels, and they did. And, with each sequel, it became highly more forgettable. I got a little bit of love for Jaws 2. I wish Spielberg had directed it. Jeanette Swark, who
Yeah.
was kind of a studio for hire kind of guy, came in to do it. There's a bit to like about Jaws 2. It's not it's what's the word I'm looking for? I was trying to find a pun. It's not the turkey that everyone regards it as. It did quite well at the box office, so much so that there was another two movies. But of course, it doesn't hold up at all to the first one. But it's not that bad. After that, it's that bad.
You completely just lost then. I've just got
Uh,
no idea what you said.
I just said Jaws 2 isn't as bad as people remember it.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to let you talk about 3 and 4.
Yeah, I've got love for part 2 as well. I think that it carries on the story pretty well. But then you get to number 3, which became a gimmick for 3D because yeah, 3D was a phase back then as well, just like it was 10 years ago. And the film suffers from just being about the effects, and Jaws was never about the effects. Jaws was about the family drama and the crisis. It was never just about the shark, and that's what they missed the point on the third film. And then you get to the fourth film, and then you just ignore the fourth film. That's the best thing to do. I know that Michael Caine's in there. Don't let that make you think that it's anything good, because it's not. It's a dreadful film where they suddenly decided to have it being that the shark's got a
It also
personal
featured
vendetta.
Lorraine Gary returning as Ellen Brody.
Yeah, it's a mess of a film that was reshot and re-edited
Because
and
that's what
had
sharks
multiple
do.
versions. Yep, not worth checking out. Will Jaws make a comeback at some point? I've got no doubt that at some point someone will greenlight another Jaws film. Do we need it? Not particularly. We've got the first film. We will always have that first film there, and it will always be a 5-star film. Even new audiences, when I've shown it to my kids, they've embraced it and love it as much as I do. They can see past the ropey effects because those effects work effectively because of how well Spielberg did them. It's a perfect film from a perfect director at the start of what was his career, and pretty much his peak era of his career was that era.
I totally agree. So, if you've not seen Jaws, then what's wrong with you and why you're listening to this show? But if you've not seen it, it was available on Netflix. It is available on Blu-ray, and it is on Apple and other streaming services to purchase. And it is an absolute classic. Thanks, Andy. That takes us nicely into this week's deep dive. It's a film that's been spoken about a lot. In fact, I've just recently watched a very informative Netflix on the films that made us about Back to the Future. but it is a classic. Came out in 1985, directed by Robert Zemeckis. It starred Michael J. Fox, Leah Thompson, Crispin Glover, and from I'm giggling, and from Buckaroo Banzai, Christopher Lloyd. And it's and it follows the story of Marty McFly, a teenager accidentally sent back to 1955 in a time-traveling DeLorean automobile, built by his eccentric friend, Dr. Emmett Brown. Trapped in the past, Marty inadvertently prevents his future parents from meeting, therefore threatening his very existence. So there's not a
Dun,
lot can be said
dun,
about
dun.
Back to the Future that's not been said already. It's an absolute classic. I think it's one of those films that ends up in most people's top 10, and especially for those of us who grew up in the 80s. It's and Andy's going to talk about this in detail. I think it's one of those defining films for that generation. Big concept ideas, an affable cast, well paced, well shot, and just intriguing enough that sets it aside from the usual sorts of box office film. And Steven Spielberg, who produced this as part of the Amblin, part of his Amblin production company, was on an absolute roll. And Back to the Future again was the highlight of this role. I saw it upon its release. It blew me away in a way that it blew everybody away. It just has exactly, it's beat for beat perfect. The perfect casting, which we'll talk about in a while. Um,
Yeah.
it's funny, it's romantic, it's adventurous, it's clever. Ultimately, it's heartwarming, and it's an eternal storyline. You could make this film now with this technology and still tell very much the same story with the same themes. And that's what makes a good classic film, that you can go back to it and still recognize something in it that talks to you about it. But as I said, I discovered it in the theaters when it came out. Andy, when did you first come across Back to the Future?
Exactly the same. Even before this film came out, I was getting obsessed with the imagery from it. I had magazines about the film because the DeLorean made this film stand out. And this is a film that made an international star of Michael J. Fox, but it also managed to make the DeLorean car line a failed production car line, the most
Yes.
desirable object to legions of teenagers around the world who have now grown up and all want to have enough money to buy an old DeLorean and kit it out in the same way. It's if this film had come out a couple of years earlier while DeLoreans were being made, DeLorean probably would still be going today, and you'd still be buying the latest release model of them. But it was just absolute perfection of using that as a time machine and acknowledging the ridiculousness of it with having the line in the script of like, you built a time machine out of a DeLorean? And it just conveys they're like, why would you pick this car? But you look at it, gull wing doors, the silvery metal framework, it looks futuristic, and that's why it works. This is a film, the direction from Bob Zemeckis, who also co-wrote with Bob Gale, and with the production credit from Spielberg, ensures that the film not only looks great, it paces perfectly, and it never feels like it underuses any moment. This is a film that the script had been gone through so many iterations. There's so many tweaks and designs, but what was left at the end had no unwarranted flab. The editing is superb. It makes sure that if something's on screen, it has a purpose. There's nothing there that is superficial. Everything is part of the core story and the heart and the emotion. There's touches of humour scattered throughout, and they all land well. And the whole affair looks as great today as what it did back then.
Yeah, even despite the fact that it has, and I didn't realize this until I watched a documentary about the movie recently, had some incomplete special effects when it came out because it was rushed through production. Because when they did a test screening of it, it was so successful that they moved it along. It's a film that's crafted with love. The concept started way back in 1980. Bob Gale and Robert Zemeckis were film students together. they sold their first script to Spielberg, which was 1941, which again is one of those films we should talk about at some point. They were seen as kind of the new saviors of Hollywood. Zemeckis was an up and coming director who Spielberg took under his wing in many ways and mentored him, but they just couldn't get a hit. They did some great films together, including "I Want to Hold Your Hand," which is a brilliant little movie about the Beatles first appearing in the US, and then they did that with Used Cars, which is an out and route laugh a minute comedy, stars Kurt Russell, but again it didn't loud. Sorry, again it didn't land for an audience. Zemeckis went on to do another project while Bob Gale was sketching out an idea that eventually became Back to the Future. And that was Romancing the Stone. And that was a big hit. And that gave them the opportunity to make Back to the Future. There were all sorts of problems with studio before it landed. And ultimately, as we know, it was one of the biggest hits of the year. But it's also one of those films that's become a part of our a part of what's the word I'm looking for, Andy? It's sorry, it's one of those films that's just become a part of our culture. You can't think of the term Back to the Future anymore without thinking of those movies. It influenced Rick and Morty, which is a direct send up of Back to the Future. In fact, if you see the earlier cartoons, it's a lot closer to Back to the Future in its storyline. It's such a perfect film. It was nearly a very, very different film, as legend goes, with the casting. Everybody wanted Michael J. Fox for the role. He couldn't do it due to a TV series he was in at the time. So another actor was brought in. And that actor was, who was it again?
Eric Stoltz.
Was Eric Stoltz. And it didn't land. He wasn't the comedic actor that Michael J. Fox with, and the charisma wasn't working. And the film recast during production. Michael J. Fox came in, and you can't think of Back to the Future without Michael J. Fox in it. His relationship with Buckaroo Banzai's Christopher Lloyd was absolutely perfect, and the rest is film history.
Yeah, I mean, the casting of this is critical to why it's so successful. The energy of the cast, especially Fox, who amazingly keeps that energy despite the fact that whilst filming this, he was spending the day filming Family Ties for TV, then breaking from that, heading over the lot, going over to Back to the Future, filming that until the early hours of the morning, getting like 2 hours sleep, then getting up to start the process all over again. How he kept alive, let alone energetic, is a complete bewilderment. But he's got an instant charm to his character. It's impossible for audiences not to warm to Marty's plight. And the excellent support from everyone around him, the magnificent Christopher Lloyd, as eccentric as he could possibly be, is so perfect. You cannot imagine anyone else in a Doc Brown-esque kind of role. Leah Thompson playing the young and old mother, and Crispin Glover playing nervy and nerdy to perfection. Thomas F. Wilson became everyone's favourite bully in the form of Biff Tannen. He's a bully that you actually enjoy watching on screen, despite the fact he's not a great character. The whole cast make the whole thing work. And I've seen so many documentaries with behind the scenes, and you can see the energy and the fun that they were having on set that is conveyed so perfectly across into the end result. The time travel element, you know what I'm like with time travel. I get very picky. If something doesn't make sense, I start to get too analytical. I mean, it's all theoretical anyway, but I still obsess over the science of time travel. And this film handles it well by never bogging itself down with trying to explain it. All it just basically says is like, well, yeah, we went back in time, just accept that it works. Here you go. And as long as you're willing to suspend that and not get bogged down, I'm willing to do it. No one else should get obsessed. The tale then lets the character drama take the center stage. It's a time travel film, but the characters are more important than the time travel. And one of the absolute baffling things is that this is a film that is so likable and charming that it even tackles the topic of what if your mother wanted to get together with you without making it seem creepy.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the thing about talking about Back to the Future is there's so many, there's so much coverage of it. It's not one of those movies which has not been documented in some way. Most people are aware of the casting change. Most people are aware of most people are aware of that the film went through this long production process and against all odds became the huge hit. And I think the reason we're talking about Back to the Future is because you can draw something so personable to it that the reason that they were all three films ultimately were big hits, but initially Back to the Future is that we are all Marty McFly to a degree. We're all that kid who's asked those questions, and that's why Michael J. Fox was just the perfect casting. He was us. He was every kid who's ever thought about time travel and made it feel as though you could do it, and that's what would happen if you went back in time and you met you met your parents and you saw them grow up. And everybody still fantasizes in their head at some point in their life about time travel. It's the
Just think,
working kids time travel movie.
yeah. Just thinking about this film, though, anytime someone mentions Back to the Future, straight away in my head, that iconic theme tune starts playing. I cannot talk. Even as I'm talking now, I can hear it going dun, dun, dun in my head because it's so perfect. Alan Silvestri's score is one of those tunes that sits perfectly with all the events of the film, that it's impossible to separate the sound from the images. Much like Indiana Jones. You talk Indiana Jones and straight away you've got da, 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 da in your head. Or Star Wars. I've just said Star Wars. You know that you've got at least one of the themes from Star Wars playing around at the back of your cranium now. Throw in a pop tune by Huey Lewis and the News, who also got a nice comical cameo early on in the film. And the film is just sci-fi comedy magic.
Yeah.
When it got to the sequels, which the part 2 arrived in 1989 and part 3 in 1990, they were filmed back to back. I remember when I saw part 2 at the cinema, I didn't take to it. There was something
I
that
agree
felt
with you there.
off. I think it's because without part 3, part 2 just feels like a jumble. It feels like it's throwing in too many sci-fi concepts of time travel, like alternate realities, etc., and it just feels a bit messed up. But once part 3 came out and flipped it back to the Old West and concluded the trilogy, part 2 then got a rewatch, and I embraced it even more. And now I see it as, if I watch Back to the Future Part 1, I immediately go on to Part 2 and Part 3 because I see it all as one full story. And it's one of those full stories that whilst you don't need Part 2 and Part 3 to enjoy the first one, it works as a whole trilogy. And thankfully, aside from a cartoon series and a failed TV live action with completely different cast, it's never seen any further sequels.
And I don't think it will ever be remade. And that kind of begs the question again because it is a classic, and if you haven't already, at some point you will show your children, as I will do that as well. Why do we think it's still relevant? And I think that's the question. Everybody, as I said, has talked about the making of it and why the film became the big success. But why do you think it's still relevant? And why do you think it can really be purely God, having that tease made me worse. Really be purely termed a classic movie.
I think it's because even though it's an 80s film, and for me, it represents the best of the 80s, and there are 80s themes within there, the time travel aspect taking it back to the 50s means that it's not ingrained in the 80s. So it
Yeah.
doesn't feel dated today because the 50s were dated anyway. So you accept that past relationship. Like I said, it's the energy of everything. There's nothing that specifically categorizes it as it's of this period. It's a film that is open for anyone to embrace. Like I said, the effects hold up, even though they weren't completed and some of them looked a bit shonky back then. But in the same way that Jaws, the effects hold up because you look past the flaws, because you're just caught up with it. It's a film that doesn't demand it doesn't demand anything of you. It just asks you to sit and enjoy it and go along with the ride. And it's the characters. It's a character, like I said, it's character driven more than sci-fi driven. So you might not have a love of sci-fi. You might think time travel is all bunkum and nonsense, but you are following the plight of Marty McFly, and it's impossible not to like Michael J. Fox in anything. Let's be honest, the guy has been in so many things that the films themselves might have been a bit weak, but he carries them along because he's so engaging. And Back to the Future is, in my opinion, his best role, his best character, and I'm going to say it, this is the best film of the 80s.
For me, it's because it's inventive, and it's still inventive. You can watch it time and time again in isolation without watching it with the rest of the film, and it feels clever, and it's beautifully constructed. It's still funny. The gags land, and there's a moral to it as well. And it's not a moralistic film, but it's just the idea that everybody's got parents, and you always wonder what your parents are like when they were young, and that's eternal. Every generation has that, but it's going back in time and changing just enough for everything to turn out okay. And I think that's a dream that just doesn't go away. I think everybody wants to go back into at some point into their life and make things better in the present day. And I think that's a fantasy we all have. And Back to the Future expresses that absolutely perfectly.